Mr. Watts, he is armed himself shots. Watch it, tear gas. Live rounds. Also, I can see that.
But since Mike wasn't there, no, you come on the East Coast.
You listen to me.
Right? No, you come on the East Coast.
You listen to me now.
You gotta listen to me too, man.
I am listening to
right? Now, I see you on the East Coast. The day when they get a protest of them, the next day, that's when you see one bigger heads come up to talk to my family. Right? And that's bad. If we didn't do a protest, we want to see nobody for justice. You see? I'm not holding back nothing. I'm not holding back nothing. I just need justice for my family.
You know, people ask me all the time, why do you do this? Why do you not retire and read books and write fancy academic papers? And I say, yes, that is also important. But what is more important is that I was given an opportunity to read books in the first place, to engage with ideas because of the sacrifices of ordinary people. And so part of scholarship must be given back to the people in the form of public engagement. See myself as a public scholar, what we call an activist scholar or a scholar activist, who's always trying to use the knowledge that is gained from reading books, from observing people in their communities, in their society, and giving them back, in the words of a UC Kwayana, giving them back to the people as a political nourishment and by extension, cultural nourishment. That's what I'm about. It's about being that public scholar whose work is not just confined to the classroom, but that classroom is extended to the public space.
Rude boys gonna get you by degrees. Here comes the West Indies. And when you're facing the generals, nearly every ball is a funeral. And when we battle, brother, go and put your men on the boundary line. And if you give we a liquor, that is merely a hiccup. Look, you win the little battle, you lose the war. It's the same result every time. Everybody sing. Here come the West Indies. Here come the West Indies. Them rude boys gonna get you by degrees. Here come the West Indies. I tell you now, here come the West Indies. Here come the West Indies. Them bad boys gonna bring you to your knees. Here come the West Indies. Special request to the Trinity posse. And what about the Guyana posse? And what about the Jamaica posse?
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
If you hear that, black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's a textile. Lift your head like me. You got to wear it for with dignity. How it born out. Black is beautiful. I said, sing it along. Black is beautiful. Say, I'm black and proud. It's my time that we get rid of that old slave mentality.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to Politics 101. It's Easter Monday in the English-speaking Caribbean. Still, we celebrate Easter Monday. And I take it that most of you, if not all of you, would have done something for Easter Monday. Those of you who are in Guyana or the wider Caribbean, it's a day when people go to excursions and picnic and go out to the fields to fly kites and observe. Really, the Easter is Easter Sunday, but part of the legacy of the British is these bank holidays, as they call them. We have Easter Monday, August Monday. We no longer do August Monday because we've replaced that with Emancipation Day itself. But today is Easter Monday, and I'm sure that many of you, as I said, would have gone out and have some merriment on this day. It's been a long weekend for us in Guyana, starting with Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, and Easter Monday. So it's a 4-day weekend, and God knows that some of us need that long weekend, try to catch up on things that we may not have had the chance to do. So welcome to you, those of you who are able to join us. Welcome from Guyana, the wider Caribbean, in North America, Canada, the United States of America, all over the United States of America. Today, of course, is not a holiday in those countries. The Americans have not embraced the August Easter Monday holiday, and so it's work. That's how capitalism operates. Holidays, for some, it's time to make money for others. So people have had to go to work in the United States of America and Canada. In Europe, I'm not sure whether they celebrate Easter Monday in England, because of course we got it from them. I'm not sure whether they celebrate, but if you're joining us from England or from other parts of Europe, welcome to Politics 101. Tonight we are going to be talking with Vincent Alexander about what's happening at GECOM. As you know, GECOM is part of the overall plan of the government, the PPP, for controlling Guyana. Elections are part of that plan and control of GECOM. We've been talking a lot on this program about the intent of the PPP to dominate Guyana. And the playbook is out. We have seen the playbook develop in the last 3 years. We've talked about institutional racism. You know, the other side accuse us of racism, but they can't define racism. We have been able to define racism, and we have defined racism in institutional terms. And if you look at what the PPP is doing, they're using the institutions of government and state to carry out their agenda of ethnic and political domination. Ultimately, that's what it's about. And why are they trying to dominate the society? Well, you just have to look at the amount of oil that we are going to be drilling in the next 30 years and the amount of money that is going to come to Guyana. So ultimately, it's about economics. It's about the economy. Who controls the wealth of the country? That's where it's going. That's the ultimate. Remember, slavery started as an economic project. Slavery started as an economic project. And then they had to justify why people of one skin color were the slaves and people of another skin color were the enslavers. And that's how race was invented. The concept of race was invented to justify this economic project of slavery. And so what started out as an economic project enveloped the entire political economy of the societies in the world. And we are seeing that playing out with the PPP here. They want control of the wealth of Guyana. And we are arguing that they want that control in the hands of the elites of one ethnic group. And so, therefore, they have to engage in racial profiling. They have to justify why they want control of the wealth. And their justification for control of the wealth is that one ethnic group or some ethnic groups can do business. They know how to manage money. And there is one ethnic group that cannot manage money. So you see the logic. If you cannot manage money as individuals and as communities, then you cannot manage the money of the state. And so that notion of superiority of some ethnic groups and inferiority of another or other ethnic groups is being played out. And racism, by its definition, is not an individual concept. It may have started with people who had prejudices against people of different skin color, but it soon morphed into the institutions of the society. And so slavery ended, replaced by colonialism. Colonialism ended, but the institutions created by slavery and colonialism have remained intact. Some thinkers here and there. So the PPP is using the institutions and the system in order to carry out its political and ethnic agenda. The institution of the police, the institution of the army, the parliament, the electoral institutions, mainly GECOM, and the culture of anti-blackness that resides in the society. After all, people have seen in the last 3 years, bulldozing black people's homes, killing black people in their beds, there's still people in the elite in the society who are concerned about some notion of democracy. And for them, the brutalization of black people is not part of democracy. And you can only talk about institutions and not talk about the practice of politics and democracy if you believe that those victims of the brutality of the government and the state, that their lives do not matter as much as other people's lives. We've seen it play out. It's my quarrel with Kit Nascimento. And he correctly says that I'm accusing him of a privilege in society. He claims that that privilege stopped once colonialism ended. And I challenge him on that. Because my argument, our argument, is that no, Kit, yes, Black people can now do things that they didn't do during the period of colonialism. But the institutions spawned by colonialism are still there with an inherent bias against people of Black skins. And so the PPP is using the institutions. And one such institution is GECOM. Because GECOM is responsible for conducting elections, managing elections. And the assumption is that GECOM should be above party politics. GECOM should be impartial. Should be. But the majoritarian democracy allows a sitting government within the laws to determine what happens at GECOM. And the PPP, ignoring the spirit. Well, it's legal to operate within the majoritarian democracy as a one-party government. The spirit is multi-party and consensus. And the PPP is not governing in the spirit of a democratic order. They've sought to control GECOM. The first thing, when they came to power, remember, Nandalal said that the PPP is not going back to another election with the personnel at GECOM. They said that. And what have they done? They have charged the top personnel. Once you charge them and you criminalize them, then it gives you an excuse to knock them off. And then you replace them with people who are favorable to you. It's there. Some on the PPP side, Dr. Beto Ramrak keeps repeating that the PNC doesn't play by the rules. What rules, Dr. Beto Ram? What rules? The PPP and the PNC don't agree on the rules of election. Didn't before 2020. So GECOM is a very important institution. Very important institution. One person who has been fighting the battle to keep GECOM as honest and as democratic as it should be is Vincent Alexander. He doesn't only represent the opposition at GECOM. He has been a voice for the democratization of GECOM. And that is the battle. This past week, after months and months, the PPP finally used its 4-seat majority, 3 plus the chair, to put in place a candidate as the deputy CEO. That they've made no bones that they favor him. A party is not going to favor somebody if they don't feel that that person is going to carry out their agenda. They'd already gone through the process of the CEO, and they have control of that, and now the deputy CEO. So all the major decision-making positions in the GECOM secretariat are going to be filled by people who are loyal to the PPP. And that, along with the chair, who by our votes expresses a loyalty towards the PPP by our votes. I don't know if she's a PPP member, I don't care. But our voting pattern has not been impartial. It has been more partial to the PPP than impartial. So let's bring in our guest, Vincent Alexander, and let's start our conversation this evening. Good evening, Brother Vincent.
Good evening, good evening.
Well, after that long struggle, at the end of the day, the candidate that the PPP wanted to be the deputy CEO was put in place last week. Explain to our audience the scenario. How did we get to where we got last week? We know that the deputy CEO, Roxanne Myers, was charged and then removed from a GECOM. What happened after then?
First of all, it should be noted that after the elections, all of the senior managerial positions came vacant for one reason. By that, I'm referring to the CEO's position, the deputy CEO's position, the assistant CEO's position, the registration manager position, the logistics manager position. All of those positions became vacant for one reason or another. In fact, some of them were vacant prior to the elections, and the process for filling those positions even at that time. What we have seen after the elections is either an attempt not to fill those positions or to fill them with people who are favored by the People's Progressive Party, in defiance of the very rules and regulations of GECOM itself, so that the people who are making every effort to fill those positions with favored persons are the same people who have been party to articulating the conditions requisite for filling those positions. And this started with the position of the Chief Elections Officer. The Chief Elections Officer position, as advertised by GECOM, requires the person to have 5 years election management experience. not management experience, 5 years management experience, did not occupy a senior position for 5 years. To favor for that position in exposure as the assistant public relations officer to the chairperson. So five.
We seem to be having some.
Sufficed in the face of 5 years required, and a majority vote who was given the job. He did not have a repeat, did not have the number of years required. And if one goes back to the advertisement, one would see the advertisement says that this 5 years is a prerequisite. So there's no flexibility on that criteria. Notwithstanding he did not have the 5 years in the senior position, they sought to concoct a record to suggest that he meets the criteria. So that was the first position that was filled in that, what I call contrived manner. We then went on to the position of the Assistant Chief Elections Officer. What occurred in that instance? We had about 20-something applicants. We collectively shortlisted, I think it's about 68 applicants. My disposition to shortlisting is that you look at the requirements and only shortlist people who meet the requirements. And I say that because having shortlisted 68 applicants, there came a time when the chairperson declared that the applicants who we had shortlisted had not met the requirements. And so they re-advertised. When they re-advertised, we argued that there were people who met the requirements, and how could you exclude them? So they eventually agreed that those persons who had previously applied need not reapply. And what we got essentially was one application from a previously retired ACO, Assistant Chief Elections Officer. And they then proceeded to shortlist that person among other persons who had previously been shortlisted. So the fact of the matter is that there were sufficient numbers previously for us to have proceeded with the interviews, and from that pool to pick someone. But they added someone to the pool under the pretext that we hadn't qualified persons. And certainly it was a pretext because we then went on to re-include the persons whom we had described as not being qualified. And then in the interviewing process, picked the new applicant, arguing that the new applicant had the experience and all that went with it. I have no doubt that the new applicant had the experience and the qualifications. But what is clear is the new applicant had not applied in the first instance. And if GECOM was transparent in its operations, we would have gone to interviews with the other 8 persons who met the criteria and would have gotten an ACO from that group. But apparently, there was no one of their choice in that group. And so they concocted this arrangement to have an additional applicant who then they used the majority to appoint as the ACO. Separate and apart from appointing that person, it should be noted that here is a situation where you have an institution looking away from experienced, qualified, relatively young people to appoint someone whose age is well past the retirement age in the public sector, almost by a decade, appointing that person. So one clearly does not see a situation where you're trying to build an institution, but you're merely trying to insert people with whom you're comfortable. And the you, in this instance, refers to the People's Progressive Party through their nominated commissioners. And then we had this long hiatus, dilly and dally, and all sorts of complaints about interviewing for the DCU. Interestingly, that position was also re-advertised, and a person who had not previously applied was the additional person coming onto the landscape after it was re-advertised. So that person applied, and clearly at the time of application did not meet the requirement, and more particularly, did not have the number of years of experience. I've had about 3 years of experience at the time when he applied. And we dillied and dallied and found all sorts of reasons not to proceed with the recruitment process. And during that period of dillying and dallying, we saw that person being appointed to a non-existent position of coordinator of operations, all of which would have provided basis to argue that he was experienced. But we pushed back on that position, and after some time, information which had not been brought to our knowledge, he was appointed without the commission knowing. It's only because we inquired that we eventually knew after months this had occurred. And after about 2 months of arguing that it was an irregular act, there was no such position as coordinator of operations, no vacancy. In the instance if there were a vacancy, it is the commission that is responsible for managing that recruitment. The commission was in no way involved in that recruitment. And after arguing that case for about 2 months, the appointment was rescinded. But the process of delaying the identification of the DCU continued. We had shortlisted, and then we were told that given there was a new commissioner, that there was need for that commissioner to be given an opportunity to shortlist. And I think that took about 8 months, about 8 months for him to shortlist. And when he shortlisted, then it took him some time to be available for the interviews, by which time the other fellow was probably, in their view, accumulating the time required to meet the requirements. But we got to the recruitment process without him having the required number of years. By that time, he'd fallen short by 3 months. But if one was to consider that he should have applied, having met the requirements, he was well short at the time of his application by 1 year. We then proceeded to the interviews, and in like manner with the previous appointments, notwithstanding the applicant himself admitted he did not have the required number of years, we saw another concoction to have him selected. And that concoction saw the chairperson herself seeking to disqualify the other applicant using the reverse mechanism that was used to ensure the CEO was appointed. When the CEO was being appointed, they found also little tasks to bring together to say that he had the experience. And in this instance, what they did was to say, well, you know, she was acting, and her acting appointment was not continuous. She acted and then didn't act and all of that. Attempted a calculation which says, well, she didn't meet the requirements. But the fact of the matter is that for that entire period which they concocted of her acting and not acting, she carried out the responsibilities of that office and therefore acquired the experience. Suffice to say that her substantive appointment can also be considered to be a senior managerial position. So for all intents and purposes, she was dogged out by that contestation that her 5 years plus, she didn't necessarily act continuously. But the fact of the matter is she was never reverted to her substantive position. She remained in that office for those 5 years. And on that basis, they appointed someone who clearly had not met the requirements. So he's in a position where we have the three most senior officers at this time, the CEO, the DCU, and the ACU, all being appointed under circumstances that raise eyebrows, because in none of the circumstances, the criteria which GECOM itself and these pious persons agreed to were applied to the purpose of determining who should the point. We observe that GECOM has moved away from standard recruitment process. No longer do we have score sheets and scores against criteria. We don't have that anymore. GECOM merely says, well, you have an interview, you have a discussion, and essentially what you have is a vote. So we have vulgarized democracy to ensure that in what should be a major democratic institution, that anti-democratic mechanisms are utilized to determine persons who are recruited. They have sought to argue that Ms. Roxanne Myers benefited in a similar manner. That is far from the truth. There was no such issue of her meeting the years of requirement. No such issue. The issue at her time was that Mr. Prasad did not meet the academic requirements. And that too cannot be refuted. He did not meet the academic requirements when he was contesting against her. Suffice to say that when he was first appointed, he had not met the academic requirements because he did not have the required experience and or degree. In the second instance, he did not have the number of years required. Attempt to juxtapose his appointment to Prasad's appointment is another attempt to divide. And in no instance one can objectively see Myers' appointment as any act of wrongdoing, as has been the case with the CEO, the DCU, and the ACU.
Vincent Alexander there walking us through the process of manipulation
So we are
of manipulation of the
officers being
standard operation. Vincent, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Walking us through the manipulation of the standard operation procedure. We use the term now best practices. And so in a technical way, you're manipulating the institutions, violating the procedures and the best practices. Vincent, the next question, to what end? To what end? And here is where I think
obviously, to what end? The issue is one of control. We've had a situation in GECOM where a number of the things that ought to be done are not embarked upon. Attempts are made to do things that ought not to be done. And it's only when we push back and there are threats of court action by the opposition party that some of these things are corrected. You may recall there was an attempt to have the minister's order in relation to the demarcation of constituencies imposed in GECOM, when the law clearly states that the function of demarcating constituencies is not one that belongs to the minister. So what we have is a commission where things are being done in a manner that represents the disposition of one set of people. There's no consensus or rational basis. And one will then be able to argue that if you have a commission where that's the problem, then you can have workers, administrators, managers who throw up to the commission what that faction desires. And that's important to note. Because, for example, some time ago, GECOM agreed that we should be involved in taking fingerprints electronically. That was an agreed position of GECOM. The commissioners who are there now are not there when that was agreed. On the basis of that agreement, in budgeting for 2023, the officers placed on the budget the acquisition of the equipment for capturing fingerprints electronically. The officers did that. And lo and behold, the commission turned it down, although we had previously agreed. So there's no continuity in the commission. They turned it down. The point I want to make is that if you have client officers, then they wouldn't have to turn down a reasonable thing such as capturing fingerprints electronically. You don't have to turn that down. You would have the officers themselves not putting it on the table. Because very often propositions come from the technical and expert staff. So if you can put in place a client, technical, and expert staff, you wouldn't have them making propositions that you don't agree with. And you would have them, in fact, concurrent when commissioners seek to impose their will and their views. So basically what you're seeing is the putting together of a team on the side of the commission per se and the administration that will then be the determining factor in what happens in GECOM. So the whole issue is one of controlling the mechanism at all levels so that their wishes are realized.
Vincent Alexander, they're laying it out, our control of the administrative machinery of GECOM, the three top officers, the CEO, the assistant CEO, and the deputy CEO, were all put in place by practices that have been questionable, and that they were all supported by the PPP. And then PPP commissioners, and then assented to by the very PPP commissioners plus the vote of the chair. And we kept saying over and over, we keep saying that the chair since 2020 has voted overwhelmingly with the PPP commissioners than with the opposition appointed commissioners. So we see the linkage between the technical management, the technical administration of GECOM, and if you will, the political decision making, a la the commissioners. And as Vincent has said, clearly the end is to control. And if you control, you then know what that means. And here is what it means, because I'm bringing Vincent now into that. There is still no agreement on what to do about the bloated voters list. There is still no agreement on how to ensure that that bloated list is not manipulated to give one party or the other the edge. Given what happened 2020 and given the fact that GECOM did not do a review, an in-house review of its own conduct of the election. So, no agreement to the voters list, no agreement on mechanisms to ensure accountability and ensure that voters don't cheat the system, and an absence of a review of the 2020 fiasco. So when you take control of the administration, control of the commission, and now disagreement on these big things, the plot thickens. Where are we, Vincent, with what to do about the bloated voters list? What to do about mechanisms to ensure that people don't cheat the system, such as biometrics? And is your proposal for an internal review of the conduct of the last election still on the table? And if it's still on the table, what is the attitude to it?
All of those things are propositions still there, which the nominated commissioners of the People's Progressive Party have pushed back on, and which has gotten the support of the chairperson. On the question of biometrics, what she has attempted to say is that a feasibility study is required on one hand. I don't accept that, though that is a decision that has been made, because what we are attempting to do is nothing new. It's something that's been tested and tried all over the world. And I don't see what is the relevance of a feasibility study. I don't see what's the relevance of a feasibility study, for example, to taking fingerprints electronically at the offices. There were really no issues involved. And the technical people did not see issues, they came forward there. But that's how she came down on that one, feasibility studies required. And then went on to say that on the question of biometrics for identification of the place of poll, that it can only be an alternate identification mechanism, cannot be an original mechanism. And that too, I don't agree with. That argument cannot pass the test for the simple reason that it is accepted that for someone to vote, the person has to be identified. You have to know that the person who's turned up is the person who's registered to vote. Presently, we use two mechanisms. We use either the person's ID card or we use an affidavit which says that an attestation that the person is indeed the person. And that's a highly flawed system that we have in Guyana for that and for birth certificates. We now have that as well. But those are the two mechanisms we use. If you're arguing that someone has to be identified to vote, if you're arguing that there was some judgment which says that a voter's ID card is an impediment and therefore you can't impose a voter's ID card, you cannot argue that electronic fingerprints at the place of poll is equivalent to a voter's ID card or an impediment. In fact, electronic fingerprints is superior to an ID card, superior to an affidavit, because it is almost the 100% mechanism of ensuring the person who's come to vote is indeed the person who's registered. And in no way is it a mechanism that can disenfranchise someone who's entitled to vote. It's better than an ID card. It's better than an affidavit. And to say that one needs a feasibility study when it's been tried and tested all over the world, and two, that it can only be used as an alternative. In other words, if the person doesn't have an ID card or the person doesn't attest, then you could use it, certainly flies in the face of the logic that fingerprint represents the person's presence more than any other thing could represent. More than an ID card, because you can get false imaging of the ID card. More than attestation, because you can have people who are not truthful, but fingerprint, electronic, is foolproof. And so when people refuse to have mechanisms like those in place, they certainly have ulterior motives that are driving the refusal. And this is not a matter of conjecture, because we saw a situation in the recount where of the thousands which were sent by the APNU AFC, at least around 600 were taken for actual determination. And of the 600, in one instance, 190 something, in the other instance, 200 something, over 500 plus of the 600 were verified as persons who were not in the country. This is information that GECOM has. It's information that the Attorney General has, because he requested it. And he requested even the information of those which were not verified, and has remained for the last 4 months patently silent, when in fact, if he could come forward proving otherwise, it would be to his advantage. But with the patent silence, they're still refusing to put mechanisms in place that can resolve the problem. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with a system which we cannot rely on. It leaves us with a system that does not provide justice. It leaves us with a system where wrongdoing knowingly can prevail. And where does that leave us in the final analysis? As citizens who cannot get the kind of redress the system should provide, then in fact, the system is not functioning. The citizens can no longer be called upon to submit themselves, supposedly doing the right thing, in a system where the right thing is not upheld. And so it probably leaves us where it left Fidel Castro and where it left Nelson Mandela. That's where it's probably left us.
And yes, and those comparisons are very compelling, and at the level, because you take it to the level of the citizenry, and their rights that are being trampled upon and taken away from them, basically the right to vote and have those votes honestly counted. That right is being taken away. And that is not just a constitutional right, is a civil right and a human right. And your formulation of where it leaves us, I think, is very, very, very compelling. At the other level, you also have a situation where we are left with a mechanism that is not agreed upon by all stakeholders. And in this age of consensus, in the operationalizing of democracy, the fact that there is no consensus between the two major stakeholders leave a gaping hole in the system. Vincent, I want to ask you a question that I've always wanted to ask you and I kept forgetting. There were 48 boxes on these coasts that did not have statutory documents. Explain to us how boxes without statutory documents impact the outcome of an election.
All right. The number of votes in those boxes is in the vicinity of 14,000 votes. Vicinity of 14,000. Those votes are equivalent to 2 seats, approximately, at our elections. In an election where the difference between the governing party and the opposition is 1 seat, and you have 2 seats that can be contested because you could not verify the ballots, puts you in a position where the result could very well be different. The result could very well be different. So it's a fundamental problem. In electoral politics, when you have a numbers problem, the question that would normally be asked, what is the likely impact of these numbers on the outcome? If the impact of the numbers in the outcome are negative, then the tendency is, though you recognize that there is a problem, the result is upheld. We have a situation where the result has been upheld when the impact, the possible impact of 14,000 could change fundamentally the results. It's on that basis that Mr. Lowenfield sought to give a declaration to the exclusion of those votes. And he sought to do so under his own interpretation of what the court had said at that point in time. But my disposition was a little different to his.
Yeah.
My disposition was that in those 14,000 votes, there would have been votes. We don't know how many. There would have been valid votes. And therefore, you could not do anything that disenfranchises a single vote, knowingly and consciously. And so my recommendation was that since there's a big question mark over this block of votes, that we should simply run a by-election in that geographical area to ensure that the people are given their right and to ensure that there is no problem like that which had occurred, so that the ballots have integrity, and to use that as the basis for declaring the results in that area, which would then impact on the overall results. And for me, wherever the chips fell, that would have been it, because what we were looking for is ballots that could not be questioned. We'd already made the false step of going into an election where we know and has since been proven that multiple voting is a possibility. But we've gone into that. So, in a sense, you're giving in to a faulty system. But here was a possibility of correcting whoever was mischievous, on whichever side. It could not be wrong. It could not be wrong to hold a by-election and to sanitize the votes, the ballots in that area, and to have us have a through result. And so again, I think that people who would not have appreciated my suggestion, which I made at the level of the commission, have given in to a dysfunctional system, and therefore results which cannot stand complete public scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. And again, the question of motive comes up, because on the face of it, your proposal potentially would have benefited the PPP more, because these were PPP strongholds. These boxes were in PPP strongholds. At a by-election, they would have had the chance, for example, of mobilizing more of their supporters who didn't vote at the election to vote in the by-election. It could have ended up as a win-win situation for the PPP, and they could have proven that the disappearance of the documents from the boxes had nothing to do with them. And yet they turned that down. The question is motive. And as the older people would say, I say no more. Vincent, let's pivot to the local government election. It is clear that you and your brothers, opposition commissioners, have no confidence in the local government elections that are slated for June. Am I misunderstanding you or mischaracterizing your position? If so,
well, certainly from the
go ahead.
We have is the continued use of a list that is obviously has obviously been manipulated and can be manipulated. And for that reason, though we are participants in the processes in GECOM, we have put on the record that we are not in support of the holding of the elections with that list. So we are at ground level on this matter. There are a number of other issues which have come up, but wherever those have gone, at the ground level, we are saying that we do not have the major element in place for a free and fair election, and that's a list that is not in dispute. Along the way, we have been able to contribute to correcting wrongdoing, whether by intent or by incompetence, in terms of how the list was scrutinized for local government purposes, in terms of the attempt to use the minister's order, that we were able to turn back, but we were not able to turn back the fact that still it did not internally follow the procedures and use the criteria that were required. And we've had some similar problems in the claims and objections. So apart from our ground zero position, that the election should not be held, there are additional elements which also points to a need for things to be done differently. We are not in support of the use of the list for the purpose of elections. But at the end of the day, it's a 4-3 situation. At the end of the day, it's a people's situation.
And if the commissioners do not have confidence in the process, going back, as Vincent said, to the ground, the question of the voters list, then again, both sides are not agreeing to the rules. So you're starting an election with glaring inconsistencies and glaring gaps and holes in the system. But more than that, the major stakeholders do not agree to the rules. And I think this is extremely critical in our analysis and conclusion of where we're at. Vincent, above and beyond your role as a GECOM commissioner, you are an analyst grappling with the issues of democracy within multi-ethnic states and societies and so forth. And you hinted when you said, where does this leave us? It leaves us where Castro ended up, and so forth. I mean, be a little bit more explicit. Where does that leave us as a society if half the representatives of half of the society do not have confidence in the electoral system?
The fact of the matter is that the system is not working for the good of the society. And so one would have to resort to mechanisms that are outside of the system for the correction of the system. So that, when one is faced with a situation like this, excuse me, one is left to take matters into one's own hands, rather than to submit oneself to a system which is latently dysfunctional, not serving the purposes intended to serve, and therefore not worthy of being respected and adhered to.
Yes, I mean, certainly if these matters cannot be solved or resolved at the level of GECOM, then they have to be part of a larger political solution, a larger arrangement outside, as Vincent says. GECOM obviously should be able to work out these issues, obviously, given all the pressures on GECOM, all the influences on GECOM. It's not going to be resolved there, and it has to be part of a larger political solution. Mr. Jack Dio, the Vice President, recently said that the PPP is not ready for power sharing. It's not a new position. It's an old position, 2 decades and more old of the PPP. What does this tell us about where we could end up if the PPP has turned its back on a mechanism for a political solution?
Well, one doesn't have to go as far as that. If one looks at the operation, the governance operation in Guyana today, and one sees that the PPP is unprepared to speak with government, with other stakeholders, unprepared to speak with them. Even in the instance where they have a constitutional responsibility to speak to these people, they're unprepared to speak. Then do you expect them to embrace power sharing? Certainly not. because they're not even allowing for the normal governance systems to work, which caters for participation and inclusion at a lower level than actual inclusion in terms of the sharing of the power of the state. So that I'm not surprised when he says that. And we know that what he said really is a repeat of what he said when he was the president. And there was a proposition for power sharing. He called a special forum at the residence of the president and issued a document calling for trust before talks on power sharing. I would think that if you have a problem, then you have to identify and put the mechanisms for trust to emerge in place as a part of the process of talking on these matters, rather than merely declaring there has to be trust. So who has to bring this trust about? Is he trusted? Is he to determine when there is trust? There certainly have to be mechanisms. So there have to be a commitment to things like trust that are manifest by the things you do. There's nothing that Jack Dew has done to manifest a real desire for trust. In circumstances where very often he is himself guilty of being someone who cannot be trusted because of the things he does and the things he says to this nation from a high office. So I agree that given the plurality of our society, given the historic differences that we have experienced, that there is a need to find a mechanism that allows all of us to be involved in a consensual decision-making machinery. That is what's required so we can give and take and get to something that's acceptable for all sides. Whether we get that because of the experience had in attempts to have those talks.
Vincent Alexander speaking to us tonight on elections and what's happening at GECOM and shining more light on how GECOM is being manipulated in pursuit of the PPP's desire to dominate Guyanese society, government, and state. And as I said at the beginning of the program, the larger objective is to dominate the society, government, and state within the context of increased wealth coming into the country. That should not be lost, because ultimately our struggle since independence has been a struggle about the distribution of resources, whether those resources be economic, political, or cultural. And now, with the increased economic pie, the question of who controls the government and state is even more urgent. So the manipulations, the machinations, the use of fear, the attempt to control the army, the attempt to muzzle people, the bringing back of the shackles on the feet of opposition leaders are all geared towards that objective of control. Because if you're able to control the government and state and society in that way, then it gives you free rein in terms of the economic resources that are coming in. Vincent, you have dealt with the issues of race and ethnicity and power. And so we're going to come back hopefully next week to address those issues. And of course, Part G still has an outstanding matter. Any report, any movement on that front?
No, there is no movement. We have had reason as a Prodigy to write 2 letters. First of all, we wrote to the president, reminding him that he had promised on 3 occasions to meet and speak with us, and saying to him that given all that has been happening since, all the incidents that have occurred, who is being charged, who is not being charged, and all of the incidents that occurred that have suggest that there's tremendous tension, ethnic tension in the society, and that we need to speak on those matters. We have written to him, and once again, as at this point in time, our letter to the president has been met with patent silence. Patent silence. Silence which contradicts with statements that he would have made in the past about engaging and talking and things like that. So we met with patent silence. We have also had reason to write the Attorney General because when we last appeared in court, he asked for time for us to have dialogue. And we are supposed to return to court on the 14th, a few days from now. And we have found it necessary to write, to remind him that he asked for time to have talks. Those talks are still to occur.
Vincent Alexander filling us in. We're going to try to get you back, Vincent, to talk about the racial and ethnic situation that are developing in this new era. Thank you again for coming on tonight and sharing with us the insights of what's happening at GECOM, and really, where does that leave us? Thank you, Vincent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
And to those of you who have been in the audience tonight, thank you also for joining us. Tomorrow night, Dr. Henry Jeffrey is going to be here to address the developing stories in the last week or two. The International Court of Justice ruled in Guyana's favor. We have the arrest and charge of Takuma Ogunse and other related issues. Dr. Henry Jeffrey is going to be here tomorrow, and on Wednesday, Takuma Ogunse himself would be on the program. That's our lineup for the next 2 days. Again, thank you all for tuning in to yet another edition of Politics 101. We, of course, are forever grateful to you, because without you, there is no program.